Welcome in, everybody, to another deep dive. We love to pick a topic and go deep. Well, today we're diving into the world of HUD housing and urban development, and specifically its new leader, Scott Turner.
Yeah, HUD maybe doesn't sound like the most thrilling subject for a deep dive, but trust me on this one. This guy's story and what he's doing at HUD is way more interesting than you might think.
And the story's interesting, right? And we just look at Scott Turner's path to HUD. I mean, it's pretty wild. The guy went from washing dishes at a Texas BBQ joint to playing pro football in the NFL for the Redskins, the Broncos, the Chargers.
Yeah.
Then he heads off to the Texas state legislature, and now he's running HUD. It's like, how does that even happen?
It is kind of a head-scratcher, but one piece of the puzzle is definitely his connection to former President Trump during Trump administration. Turner led this thing called the White House Opportunity and Revitalization Council.
Okay, vaguely rings a bell, remind me.
That's where he really got deep into opportunity zones. This was a big Trump initiative to encourage investment in areas that have been struggling economically. So that experience is for sure shaping how he's approaching things at HUD.
Gotcha. Okay, starting to see the connections. So we've got this former football player with deep ties to Trump and his ideas now at the helm of HUD. I am guessing that probably raised some eyebrows during his confirmation hearings.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially from Senator Elizabeth Warren. She really pressed him on the whole issue of affordable housing. The fact that there just aren't enough affordable homes out there, especially with prices going crazy. And she really wanted to know if he'd support putting more federal money into building more of them.
Interesting. And what did Turner say to that? Was he on board?
Not exactly. We actually have a clip of their exchange. Let's take a listen.
Let's hear it.
Okay, here we go.
Ooh, this is good.
All right, so this is Senator Warren asking, do you support additional federal investment in programs so that we can lower the cost of building affordable housing? And then we hear Turner's response. Thank you, Senator Warren. I appreciate our visit together, and thank you for your time in this. As you said, there are many facts to why housing is so expensive now. And I believe first we have to get our fiscal house in order in our country. Interest rates are at an all-time high. Inflation is all. And then Senator Warren jumps back in.
She's not letting him off easy.
No, she's not. She says, fair enough, Mr. Turner, but I just like to focus because it is a big problem. And I'm sorry to interrupt, but the chairman's going to be tough on time. And that is, I just want to make sure I understand, do you support additional federal investment in programs so that we can lower the cost of building affordable housing? And then finally, Turner responds, thank you, Senator Warren. What I do support is maximizing the budget that we do have and making sure that the money, and then the audio cuts off there.
Wow, even just listening to that little bit, you can feel the tension there. It sounds like Turner's more into making the most of what HUD already has rather than asking for a bigger piece of the pie,
Yeah, exactly. He kept saying things like maximizing the existing budget and making sure things are running efficiently. It's a theme that comes up a lot in his speeches, too. He's really big on cutting waste and making HUD more accountable.
So is it more of a coach approach than a politician approach? Get the team performing at its best with what they have instead of demanding more resources?
That's a really interesting way to put it. It does seem to tie back to his coaching background. He even compared taking stock of HUD's programs to his dad taking inventory at the grocery store where he worked. It's all about knowing what you've got, what you need, and using it all wisely.
I like that analogy. Okay, starting to get a sense of his style, but where does he land on an issue like corporate landlords buying up tons of houses? I mean, that's been a huge story lately, how it's driving up prices and making it really hard for regular folks to buy homes.
That actually came up in the hearing, too. Senator Warren brought it up, even mentioned that Texas Governor Greg Abbott, and he's a Republican, keep in mind, had even raised concerns about it. But Turner's response was, I don't know, kind of vague.
Like he was punting on the issue, trying not to fumble. Sorry, had to get one more football reference in there.
Exactly. He basically said he hadn't seen that statement from Abbott, which is surprising given how much attention it got and he had looked into it, but there wasn't a clear sense of what he'd actually do about it.
Interesting. So maybe not ready to tackle that one head on just yet, but what's interesting is he did talk about wanting to attract more capital to the housing market, which maybe signals that he's leaning towards solutions that rely more on private investment than on federal spending.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so we're getting a picture of Turner emerging here. Fiscally conservative, efficiency-minded with that coach mentality. But what about his overall vision? What's he actually trying to do with HUD?
Well, his first address to the HUD staff gives us some clues. They remember his comment in the hearing about 3 points into close, referencing his background as a preacher.
Right, like he was going to deliver a sermon.
That's exactly what it felt like.
Yeah.
He literally structured the whole address like a sermon. Concise, motivational, and very personal.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So what were his 3 points? What's he preaching about at HUD?
His big focus was on revitalization, bringing new life to communities.
Hmm.
And he also really stressed self-sufficiency, the idea that people should be able to support themselves without having to rely so heavily on government assistance.
Okay, interesting. And does that connect back to his work on opportunity zones under Trump?
Absolutely. It's all about attracting private investment to jumpstart economic growth in areas that have been struggling. So
Mm.
there's definitely a thread connecting his past work with his vision for HUD.
Makes sense. So he's got this vision of revitalization and self-sufficiency, but how does he plan to actually make it happen? Does he have any concrete plans?
He did mention some specific actions. Remember how Senator Warren pressed him on funding during his confirmation hearing? Well, Turner announced that his team at HUD, they call it the DOGE Task Force, had already found over $260 million in savings just by combing through the budget and eliminating waste.
Wait, DOG task force, is that a typo, like a meme?
Nope, that's really what they call it. And get this, they even claim to have found $1.9 billion that was misplaced during the Biden administration. It definitely highlights how much he's prioritizing fiscal responsibility and maybe even a little jab at the previous administration's spending.
Okay, I am genuinely intrigued. This guy is not your typical politician.
No, he's not.
All right, well, we are about out of time for part one, but before we jump into the rest of his story and what he's been up to at HUD, what stands out to you as the most surprising thing about Turner so far?
Hmm. For me, it's the parallels between his past as a football player and how he's approaching HUD. It's like he's taken the strategies and mindset of a coach and applied them to the world of housing policy, which I think is really fascinating.
Yeah, that's not something I would have expected either, and that DOGE task force still can't get over that. All right, we'll be back in part two to explore more of what Turner's been doing at HUD and what it all might mean for the future of housing in America. Okay, so we left off talking about Turner's big vision for HUD, all that revitalization and self-sufficiency stuff, and of course that memorable DOGE task force. What else has he been up to since taking over at HUD?
Well, one thing he's been pushing is deregulation. Remember how Senator Britt was praising him during the confirmation hearing for wanting to streamline regulations and cut red tape?
I do vaguely recall that, but what does that actually look like when it comes to housing?
Basically, it means he wants to cut back on the number of rules and regulations that HUD has to follow. The idea being to give more control over housing decisions to states and local communities.
Okay, I can see how that could fit with his whole vision of empowering local communities, but isn't there a risk that less federal oversight could lead to more discrimination? People being denied housing because of their race or religion or something like that?
Yeah, that's definitely a legitimate concern. It's a tough balance. How do you give more local control while still protecting fair housing rights? It's something we'll definitely want to keep an eye on how Turner approaches that.
Absolutely. Everyone deserves a fair shot at finding a decent place to live. Speaking of things to watch, what about Turner's faith? We touched on it briefly before, but you mentioned it plays a big role in his leadership.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely a core part of who he is. Remember that audio clip of him leading the opening prayer at Trump's first cabinet meeting? He was praying for wisdom and guidance and really emphasizing his commitment to serving the American people.
Yeah, I remembered that it felt really genuine, like his faith is something he truly lives by, not just something he talks about for political points.
Right. And his actions seem to back that up.
Mm.
For example, he put a stop to the Biden administration's equal access rule, which would have made it mandatory for HUD-funded homeless shelters to accommodate transgender people based on their gender identity. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I remember reading about that. It was a pretty controversial move. Some people were all for it, others were really against it.
Exactly. It definitely shows how his faith is influencing some of his policy decisions, even when it comes to those really sensitive social issues.
So how do we make sense of all these different pieces of the puzzle? We've got his focus on efficiency and deregulation, his NFL background, his work with those opportunity zones, and then this strong faith. How does it all fit together when it comes to his approach to housing?
I think what we're seeing is a leader who's very much driven by his values,
Hmm.
Fiscal responsibility, individual empowerment, and his religious beliefs and all of that is informing his vision for HUD and how he thinks it should function in society.
That makes sense, but how will that vision actually translate into action? What kind of concrete policies can we expect to see from him?
Well, based on what we've seen so far, I think there are a few key things to look out for. First, I'd expect him to keep hammering on efficiency. He's already shown he's serious about cutting waste and getting the most out of existing resources.
So more DOGE task force investigations then?
Maybe, but I think it goes beyond that. He might look into different ways to fund affordable housing, like partnering with private companies or giving tax breaks to developers who build affordable units.
Interesting. So that's a different approach than just asking for more federal money, which is what Senator Warren seemed to be pushing for.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Turner seems to be more interested in those market-based solutions, which lines up with his belief in individual empowerment and less government intervention.
Got it. So efficiency is one theme. What else?
I'd also expect him to keep pushing for deregulation. He wants to simplify those HUD rules and give more power to states and local governments to make their own decisions about housing.
Yeah, we talked about that before, and I'm still a little wary of the potential consequences for fair housing.
Yeah.
We don't want to see people getting discriminated against because of less oversight.
Yeah, that's definitely a valid point, something to keep a close eye on. But on the other hand, less regulation could also open the door to more innovation in the housing market. Maybe developers could try new things if they don't have so many rules to follow.
Okay, interesting. Could you explain that a bit more?
Sure, with fewer regulations, developers might have more freedom to experiment with new ways to build affordable housing, like using different materials or construction techniques that could help bring costs down.
Oh, I see. So less red tape could actually lead to more affordable housing options.
Exactly. But again, it's so important to make sure any deregulation is done carefully and doesn't weaken those crucial fair housing protections. It's a tough balance to strike.
Right. All right. So efficiency and deregulation are likely to be big priorities. Anything else we should be watching for?
One thing to keep in mind is that Turner's faith will likely continue to play a role in his decisions. We saw that with the equal access rule, and it wouldn't be surprising to see it influence other areas like how funding is allocated to faith-based organizations that provide housing services.
Yeah, that's a really important point. His faith seems to be such a fundamental part of who he is, and it's clearly shaping his approach to policy. But how do you think all of this will actually affect everyday Americans, particularly those who are struggling with housing affordability or even homelessness?
Well, it's still early to say for sure, but based on what we've been talking about, there are a few different scenarios that could play out.
Let's delve into those scenarios when we come back for part 3. So we were just talking about the different ways Scott Turner's policies might play out. What are some of the possibilities, especially for people who are already having a tough time making ends meet and finding an affordable place to live?
Well, if this whole emphasis on efficiency and market-based solutions, less government, more private sector, if that leads to cuts in traditional federal housing programs,
Yeah.
it could really hurt people who depend on those programs.
Mm-hmm.
Folks who rely on things like housing vouchers or public housing to keep a roof over their heads.
So some people could actually end up in a worse situation if those safety nets are weakened.
It's definitely a risk.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, if his focus on deregulation and bringing in private investment, if that actually leads to more affordable housing being built, it could potentially help a lot of people, including those who are struggling the most.
Right. It's like trying to walk a tightrope, trying to help those who need it most right now, while also coming up with solutions that make housing more affordable for everyone in the long run.
Exactly. And that's where his faith comes in, too. He's talked about how important it is to have compassion, to help those who are less fortunate. But it's one thing to talk about it. It's another thing to actually put policies in place that actually make a real difference in people's lives.
Actions speak louder than words, as they say. So it seems like a lot depends on how Turner balances all these different priorities. The efficiency thing, the deregulation in his faith, and then the very real urgent need to do something about this housing crisis that's affecting millions of Americans.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to sum it up. It's a super complicated issue. There are no easy answers. And at the end of the day, it's up to all of us, as citizens, to hold our leaders accountable and make sure they're looking out for everyone, not just a select few.
You're so right. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this, but you've done a great job of breaking it all down, connecting the dots between Turner's background, his beliefs, and how all of that might affect housing in America.
Well, thanks. That's what we try to do with these deep dives.
Yeah.
Give people the information and context they need to form their own opinions and get involved in these really important conversations.
For sure. So as we wrap up here, what's the one big takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
I'd say it's this. Scott Turner's a really fascinating guy with a unique story. His background, his faith, his whole approach to leadership. It's all shaping what he's doing at HUD. And I think it's important to pay close attention to what he does, how his policies affect people, and really engage in thoughtful discussions about the future of housing. What kind of country do we want to be when it comes to making sure everyone has a safe and affordable place to live?
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks so much for walking us through this deep dive. I learned a ton, and I bet our listeners did too.
My pleasure. I always
Yeah.
enjoy digging into these complicated topics and trying to understand the bigger picture. Yeah.
Absolutely. And remember, folks, this is just the start of the conversation. There's always more to learn. So stay curious, stay engaged, and keep asking those tough questions.